All right, so next up, I want to shift gears a little bit and start talking about one of the biggest topics in standardized testing at the moment, which is the new digital SAT. So right now, we're actually in the midst of the digital SAT rollout. We're at the time of recording, we are right here. So if you're an international student, if you test internationally, you actually would have already taken the digital SAT. That started in March of this year, 2023. American test takers will get their first experience of the official digital SAT in March of 2024. So right here. That being said, their first taste of the new format, the new digital format and structure, will actually be right here with the fall 2023 PSAT, which is a slightly different but very similar version of the SAT. So that's going to be their first experience with taking it on a computer, which we'll talk about in a second. So what do I mean by digital SAT, first of all? So I kind of alluded to this just a second ago. It's going to be taken now on a computer. The Scantron is gone. Paper and pencil is gone. I should say there's still scrap paper. All right, a couple of misconceptions, potential misconceptions that I just want to clarify. This isn't just a computer-based version of the current SAT. It's actually substantially different in some critical ways. Also, this isn't a remote test. You still have to wake up on a Saturday morning and take the test at an official testing center. All right, so here's just a little comparison, sort of visual comparison between the current SAT here and the digital SAT here. All right, some of the kind of surface level similarities and differences. There's still a verbal component and a math component. There's still 4 sections, although now we call them modules. Differences are, you'll see on the current SAT, reading and writing are split. Those are now combined. So RW stands for reading and writing. And they go, there's 2 modules of reading and writing and 2 modules of math. One of the other big differences, which you can see if you take the time to add up the minutes, is that the new SAT, the digital SAT, is substantially shorter. So almost 45 minutes shorter, which is a huge difference for a standardized test. Now, the reason this is possible actually goes along with these pairs of modules. This is actually pretty important. So the new digital SAT is also adaptive. So on that first module, so like this one here for reading and writing, and this one here for math, students will get more or less an even blend of easy, medium, and hard questions. But then after that first module is completed, they'll be routed either to a harder second module if they've performed well, or an easier second module if they've performed below a certain threshold. And depending on whether you end up in the harder module or the easier module, that's going to affect the possible score that you can achieve. So the goal is to get the harder questions on the second module, and you will get there if you perform above a certain level. Other changes, test content. So on the verbal side, the long reading passages on the current SAT, they were sort of the bane of everyone's existence. Those have been replaced with much, much shorter passages, excerpts really. There's also a greater variety in the reading material. There's now poetry, a decent amount of it actually. And there's a greater emphasis on vocabulary, kind of harkening back a little bit to the pre-2015 SAT. On the math side, it's going to be more procedural, more straightforward, less creative and abstract compared to the current SAT. And also the calculator is going to play a bigger role. And we're going to see that in a second with this very helpful video that Josh has made for us, which actually walks us through the interface and the structure of this test. So I will be quiet and let Josh in the past, take over from here.
This right here is Bluebook. It is College Board's digital testing platform that they're using to administer the digital SAT. It's also available for download from College Board's website, so you can download it today, jump in and familiarize yourself with some of the digital tools, and take one of their 4 officially released practice tests. Now this here is actually practice test 1, and we're pulling it up just so we can give you a bit of a sense of what the experience looks like, so you have a better sense of what we're talking about. Now, first thing you'll notice here is we have some poetry. This is one of those kind of interesting changes that a lot of people have focused on as they've talked about the digital SAT. It's not all that significant in the sense that a lot of the question, or a lot of what the question is testing, is pretty similar to what was being tested before, but figured it'd be a fun place to start. Now, as far as the actual experience of working through the test is concerned, we've got a couple interesting features here. One, we have a timer that's going to count down at the top of the app. This is going to let us know how much time we have left in this particular module. We can hide it if it makes us a bit anxious. I think it's probably a pretty useful tool, but very much up to the student testing. We have some other features here that allow us to navigate our space. For instance, we can choose to make the question take up the bulk of our screen or the poem itself. And we can drag this bar or just use these resizing options here. We also have a navigation bar down at the bottom. So you'll notice here that we can mark this question for review, whether we answer it or not. That's useful when we want to go back later, and this is going to make it pretty easy for us to do that. So here we can see all the questions we've answered in blue. We can see all the questions we have left to answer with sort of the dotted border. And here we notice we actually skipped question 9. So if we get to the end of the section and see that, we know we can go back, answer it before we finish. Another thing we're able to do here is strike through answer choices we choose not to consider or are convinced are wrong. And finally, we have the ability, at least in the reading and writing modules, to highlight text and annotate it. Now, this doesn't always work. It was nice that it worked here the first time, but just be aware of that. Here I'm going to save a note, and if I want to pull that note up again, I just hover over the highlighted portion of text. To finish the section, we'll work all the way through to 27 and then press next, which will pull us to this review page where, again, we're going to be able to see which questions we've answered, flagged, and omitted. That allows us to check our work before we move on. Now, I have jumped past the second module in reading and writing, past the 10-minute break to get us to the math section to show you just a couple of the tools that are unique to this section. First of all, you can see the layout's fairly similar to the layout in reading and writing. In this case, we only have one window, so we don't need to do any resizing. That's because this is a multiple choice question. If we go to the student generated questions, which are a lot like the grid-ins on the old SAT, you'll notice that we have two windows. On the left are instructions that, once you read them, are always going to stay the same, so I recommend just kind of pushing those to the side once you're done. Here, we would just input our answer. That's what makes these student produced. Otherwise, this is going to look a lot like it did on the old SAT. Now, a couple tools are a little unique to this section. You'll notice that the annotation feature is gone. In its place are a calculator and a reference sheet. This reference sheet is the same reference sheet that appeared at the top of both of the math sections on the paper SAT. But this calculator is a really nice new feature. This is Desmos's graphing calculator. It's built into the test, and it allows us to do pretty interesting things, including setting up systems of equations without having to write everything in terms of y equals. If that doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry about it, but it's something that I think a lot of students will want to master so they can do really well on this section. That's about it.
So thank you, Josh. That is about it. All right, we've given you a lot of ways in which the digital test is a lot different than the current version of the test. I want to end by saying a couple of things that cut against that. So a lot has actually stayed the same. On a kind of surface level, but still important, there's still two verbal sections, still two math sections. More importantly, I would say, the underlying skills that these two tests measure are virtually identical. So, if you are strong in algebra, have good reading comprehension, have a grasp of grammar rules, you're going to score well on the paper SAT, you're going to score well on the digital SAT. And this is borne out in the data. You don't need to look at all of this chart, but just the two little cells that I've circled here. This was a pilot program that College Board ran. They gave 6,000 students both versions of the tests, and the results were virtually identical scores on one or the other. So basically, if you're performing at a certain level on the paper test, you can expect to score about the same on the digital test. So I think for all of us that are super worried about all of these changes, I would say, really in the end, when it comes down to the actual scores, it's going to be more or less the same. All right. With that said, there is another test, which is the ACT. And so for that, I'm going to kick it over to Josh for our SAT and ACT comparison.